Hey there, sleepless rabble. You know how suburban life is supposed to be safe? White fences, quiet neighbors, the occasional barbecue smoke drifting through the air. Tonight, let me take you somewhere very different. A place the press called the House of Horrors. 6 years of silence, a locked bathroom, a dog crate, all hidden behind perfectly ordinary curtains in New Jersey. So lean back, let me take over for a while, and don't worry. You won't have to chain yourself to the toilet to make it through this one. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop me a comment down below. Where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? I love seeing how far this rabble really reaches. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to Boring True Crime for Sleep, the House of Horrors edition. It began, as these things so often do, not with flashing sirens or dramatic raids, but with a knock. Not even a loud one at first. Just a hesitant, brittle knock against the paint-chipped door of a suburban house in Gloucester Township, New Jersey. It was May of 2025, and while most of the neighborhood was winding down, lawn sprinklers hissing, televisions glowing blue behind curtains, one girl had decided that tonight was the night she would gamble her life on someone else's kindness. She was 18, though you wouldn't guess it at first sight. Malnourishment and isolation have a way of stealing years, shrinking a person into a smaller version of themselves. She looked younger, fragile, like she could fold in on herself at any moment. Her wrists were red and rubbed raw. The marks spoke louder than any words. And her eyes, those were the giveaway. Wide, glassy, a blend of terror and disbelief that she was actually standing outside under a real sky, knocking on a neighbor's door. When the door finally opened, the neighbor froze. Imagine expecting Amazon parcels or a kid selling cookies, and instead finding a gaunt teenager with unevenly hacked off hair, shaking, whispering something about chains, cages, and being trapped in a bathroom. Not your typical Thursday evening entertainment. The neighbor didn't hesitate long. She pulled the girl inside, shut the door firmly, and called 911. Her voice, according to the recording later shared in court, was trembling. "There's a girl. She says she's been held captive. Please, just send someone." It was the first time in 6 years that this girl had spoken to someone outside the twisted bubble of her own home. 6 years of silence broken by a single act of desperation. Police arrived quickly, though nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see. When they crossed the threshold of the so-called family home, just a few doors down, the smell hit them first. A pungent cocktail of animal waste, damp wood, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. It clung to clothes, burrowed into nostrils, made officers gag. Not exactly the scent of suburban safety. Then the discoveries began. A dog crate shoved against the wall, large enough to hold a child, complete with scratches along the inside bars. A bare room with nothing but a bucket in the corner. A grotesque parody of a bedroom. And a bathroom, padlocked from the outside, with a crude alarm system wired in. Every time the door opened, it would buzz, alerting the parents that their prisoner dared to move. Security innovation, suburban style. Forget burglars. Why not keep your own kid from escaping instead? Officers photographed everything, the evidence piling up like props from a particularly tasteless horror movie. Except, this wasn't a movie set. This was the daily reality for an 18-year-old who had been hidden in plain sight. News crews would later dub it the House of Horrors. Neighbors would gasp into microphones, saying, "We had no idea." As though the strange absence of the girl, The eerie quiet from inside the house, the occasional muffled noise hadn't meant anything. People are good at pretending after all, good at telling themselves, it's not my business, or I must be imagining it. Denial is the most reliable neighbor you'll ever have. But in that moment, under the flashing red and blue lights, denial was useless. The truth was right there, shackled into the very walls of that house. The girl, wrapped in a blanket, sat in the back of an ambulance, answering questions softly, haltingly. Yes, she had been kept there for years. Yes, she had been beaten. Yes, she had been locked in a bathroom, sometimes in a dog crate. Food had been sporadic, punishments creative in their cruelty. Her hair had been cut off in chunks, she said, as part of a punishment. A grotesque form of control. Humiliation disguised as discipline. And while the police gathered statements, while reporters sharpened their headlines, one question began to ripple through the town. How the hell did nobody see this coming? That is where our story begins. Not with the childhood of the perpetrators, not with some ominous foreshadowing, but right here, in the moment when the walls cracked, when horror spilled out into the quiet street, and when the mask of suburban normalcy finally tore open. Because every great horror, especially the true ones, hides in plain sight. Behind lace curtains, under tidy roofs, right next to neighbors too polite or too frightened to ask questions. The House of Horrors was no haunted mansion, no gothic castle on a hill. It was just another house. And that is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. When the officers stepped across the threshold of the Spencer Mosley residence, they entered a world that smelled wrong before it looked wrong. Odors tell stories long before the decor does. In this case, the story was one of filth layered upon filth. The pungent sting of ammonia from animal urine, the heavy musk of unwashed fabric, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sour that clung to the back of the throat. Officers later described it as the kind of smell that seeps into your uniform and refuses to wash out, no matter how many cycles you run. The hallway was narrow, cluttered with cages. Dogs barked and scratched. Chinchillas squealed from cramped wire boxes, and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures echoed from corners. The house was not a home. It was a menagerie crossed with a prison. Room by room, the discoveries grew more grotesque. The first bedroom was bare, save for a thin mattress on the floor. No sheets, no pillows, just a mattress stained with the shadowy shapes of previous nights. A single bucket sat in the corner, its purpose depressingly obvious. The walls were blank, but not in a minimalist way. Blank in a way that told you no one was meant to dream here. In another room stood the infamous dog crate. At first glance, an oversized kennel. At second glance, a confession of cruelty. Inside, claw marks etched into the metal. Not the kind of scratches you'd expect from an animal, but desperate gouges at hand height. The kind made by someone trying to push, pull, or break their way out. The officers stood in silence, knowing exactly what they were looking at, but struggling to put it into words. Then came the bathroom. Ordinary from the outside, but the padlock on the door made it extraordinary in the worst possible way. The lock wasn't subtle. It was brazen, a heavy metal clasp drilled into the frame. To open the bathroom, you had to want control more than privacy. Inside, the stench of mildew and cleaning chemicals mixed awkwardly, like someone had tried to disguise the rot but had long since given up. Wired crudely above the door was the alarm system. The kind you could buy online for a few dollars, jerry-rigged to buzz whenever the door moved. It was ingenious in the way only malevolent things can be. Cheap, ugly, effective. Imagine living in a world where your every bathroom break sets off an alarm, where relief itself becomes an act of rebellion. Outside the house, the neighbors were gathering, watching the flashing lights reflect off their windows. Some shook their heads, murmuring the usual cliches. We had no idea. They seemed like normal people. Of course they did. Monsters rarely come with neon signs. Most of them walk their dogs, mow their lawns, wave politely as they collect the mail. Evil isn't cinematic, it's boringly domestic. Reporters descended almost instantly. Microphones thrust forward, cameras rolling. The term House of Horrors, born in a newsroom not 24 hours later. The label stuck because it's catchy, sensational, and tragically accurate. But inside the police station, as evidence bags filled with shackles, locks, and stained bedding, officers weren't thinking about catchy names. They were thinking about how many nights this girl had sat in the dark, how many times she had screamed into silence. Among the items seized was a tangle of electrical cords, belts and ropes, tools of discipline, or so the mother and stepfather might have called them. The reality was simpler. They were instruments of control. A neighbor later swore she sometimes heard thuds or shouts, but brushed it off. After all, people fight. Dogs bark. And in the suburbs, you don't snoop. That unwritten rule of neighborly distance allowed horror to flourish unchecked. Even the animals in the house told part of the story. Malnourished dogs pacing in circles, chinchillas crammed together, cages crusted with filth. When police removed them, many required veterinary care. Abuse isn't neat. It leaks, contaminating everything it touches. If you mistreat your child, chances are your pets don't fare much better. One officer reportedly muttered under his breath. I've seen crime scenes with less cruelty. By the time the evidence was catalogued, the narrative was impossible to deny. This wasn't neglect that spiraled out of control. It was deliberate. Locks don't appear by accident. Cages aren't bought by mistake. An alarm doesn't wire itself to a bathroom door unless someone has a very particular goal in mind. And yet, here's the bitter twist. For 6 years, this house stood quietly among others just like it. For 6 years, no one asked why the girl disappeared from school, why she never came outside, why the curtains stayed drawn. 6 years in which the horror hid not behind Gothic stone walls, but behind beige vinyl siding. The media would later circle like vultures, dissecting every photograph, replaying every neighbor's interview. But for those who walked through the rooms that night, no amount of coverage could match the raw, suffocating atmosphere of the place. The house itself seemed to whisper, "You could have stopped this, but you didn't." The discovery set the stage for what came next. The arrest of Brenda Spencer and Brandon Mosley, the so-called caretakers whose idea of parenting blurred into sadism. But before we get to them, before we lay their lives under the microscope, we need to rewind further. Because the question remains, how did it start? How does a 6th grader go from classrooms and playgrounds to cages and padlocked bathrooms? The answer, as it so often does in American suburbia, begins with one word: homeschooling. To understand how 6 years of captivity unfolded without interruption, you have to picture the backdrop. Gloucester Township, New Jersey, is the kind of place that prides itself on being ordinary. Rows of modest houses, cars parked neatly in driveways, the occasional American flag fluttering from a porch. Children play basketball in cul-de-sacs, parents complain about property taxes at barbecues, and everyone waves politely, even if they don't know your name. It's the sort of environment where tragedy feels imported. something you read about in headlines from other states, not something that germinates in your own backyard, which is precisely why it thrived here. Evil, when dressed in sweatpants and mowing the lawn every Saturday, is virtually invisible. The girl at the center of this story was once just another face in the local middle school. 6th grade, 2018. She wasn't particularly notorious, neither the star athlete nor the outcast. Just a child orbiting in the awkward gravity of adolescence. Teachers remembered her as quiet but capable. Then, almost overnight, she was gone. The explanation? Homeschooling. Now, to be fair, homeschooling in the United States isn't inherently sinister. Plenty of families choose it, citing religious reasons, safety concerns, or the belief that they can provide a more tailored education. But it also has loopholes big enough to hide an entire childhood inside. Regulations vary wildly by state, and in New Jersey, oversight is minimal. Parents simply have to assert that they are providing equivalent instruction, no home visits, no mandatory testing, no surprise inspections. Just trust. And trust, as it turns out, was the fatal flaw. The school accepted the notice without much protest. Bureaucracy moved on, another file closed. Teachers wondered briefly why they'd never see her again. But paperwork has a way of silencing curiosity. The world of homework assignments and cafeteria chatter rolled forward, leaving one student erased without fuss. Inside the Spencer Mosley household, the homeschooling narrative was less about textbooks and more about control. The girl's education didn't involve history lessons or algebra. It involved learning how to survive confinement. Her lessons were silence, obedience, endurance. The curriculum was pain. Some neighbors recalled vague rumors. One claimed they saw the girl less and less, until she simply vanished from the yard altogether. Another remembered asking Brenda once at the mailbox, "How's your daughter doing?" The answer, "Oh, we're homeschooling now." It's just better for her delivered with a smile, as if she had announced a new after-school hobby. The neighbor nodded, offered the polite, "That's great," and moved on. Because in suburbia, you don't pry. Curiosity is considered rude. That single interaction may have been one of the last times anyone outside the family asked about the girl. Meanwhile, the house itself grew shabbier. Curtains stayed drawn even on sunny days. Packages stacked up on the porch. Dogs barked more often, and the smell, according to later gossip, started to creep into the street. Some neighbors muttered, others shrugged. Everyone had an explanation. They're busy. They keep to themselves. Maybe they're going through something. Denial, again, is suburbia's favorite pastime. And while the neighborhood rationalized, inside the girl's world shrank. First, it was being kept home for her own good. Then, restrictions multiplied. Certain rooms became off-limits. Bathroom visits timed and monitored. Food rationed. Privileges stripped away. At one point, she was reportedly forced into a dog crate for months. It wasn't an abrupt descent into cruelty. It was incremental, like the tightening of a noose. Each new rule justified by another lie. Protection, discipline, necessity. By the time the crate was replaced by a padlocked bathroom, her identity as a daughter had evaporated. She wasn't treated as family anymore. She was property. Contraband to be hidden from the world. Here's the irony. All of this happened under the cover of a legitimacy. The magic word homeschooling was the shield that deflected every possible question. No teacher rang the alarm. No official knocked on the door. Because the system said, parents know best. But what happens when parents are the threat? The Turpin case in California, just a few years earlier, had already shown the dangers. Children chained to beds, starved, kept away from school, all justified under the vague umbrella of home education. The Fritzl case in Austria was even more grotesque, though built on different foundations. And yet, each time, the same question echoes. How did no one notice? The answer isn't dramatic. It's paperwork, loopholes, a society that would rather assume the best than confront the worst. And so the girl disappeared. Not with a bang, not with a kidnapping from a playground, not with a police chase. She simply faded from view, erased by her mother's signature on a homeschooling form. One bureaucratic slip turned her life from a childhood into a sentence. Her classmates grew older, went to dances, sat exams, learned to drive. She, on the other hand, learned how to survive silence, how to endure hunger, how to live under the constant gaze of an alarm system wired to her bathroom door. This is the cruelest part of captivity. The world keeps moving while you stay still. By the time neighbors really started to notice her absence, it was already too late. Whispers about the family circulated. Why was the house always shut up? Why did Brenda look more haggard? Why was Mosley suddenly so short-tempered in public? But nobody followed through. Nobody asked loudly enough to shake the silence. And thus the perfect suburb remained perfect, at least on paper. Meanwhile, one child's world had shrunk to 4 walls, a bucket, and a lock. The cruelty inside the Spencer Mosley house wasn't loud. It wasn't the sort of violence you hear in action movies with crashing doors and shouted threats. It was quieter, slower, and infinitely more exhausting. It was the kind of cruelty that wears you down one humiliating detail at a time until you stop even hoping for rescue. At first, confinement came in the form of rules. You can't go outside, you can't use this room, you can't eat until we say so. That's how abuse always begins. Restrictions disguised as discipline. Then came the physical barriers. A dog crate purchased, not for dogs but for a daughter. Oversized, metal, cold. For about a year, according to her later testimony, she slept curled inside it. Imagine the sound. The metallic rattle every time she shifted in the night. The scrape of her fingernails against steel. And then, imagine being the parent who walked past that crate, coffee in hand, pretending this was normal. After the crate came the bathroom, padlocked from the outside, fitted with a crude alarm system. A system so sensitive that the simple act of turning the handle set off a shrill buzz that echoed through the house. Privacy wasn't an option, neither was dignity. If she needed the toilet, she had to earn permission. If she wanted silence, she had to endure humiliation. Food, when provided, was often minimal. Neighbors would later gossip that the family's grocery deliveries didn't seem large enough for everyone inside. That checks out. Malnutrition was one of the first things doctors noted when she was examined after her escape. Her body bore the signs of irregular meals, low vitamins, chronic hunger. Starvation as parenting technique, it's cheaper than piano lessons, I suppose. Then there were the punishments. Reports mentioned belts, electrical cords, and other household items repurposed into instruments of control. But one punishment stood out in her statement: haircutting. At various points, the mother or stepfather would shear her hair unevenly, chopping it off in patches. It wasn't just about cruelty. It was about erasing her identity, taking away the one thing she might have controlled. Nothing says you belong to us like robbing a teenager of the chance to feel like herself. In psychological terms, it's called degradation. In everyday language, it's just cruelty with scissors. The room itself became its own punishment. 4 walls, bare. A bucket in the corner. light that crept in only through cracks. You'd think that after years of smartphones and streaming services, parents might get creative with discipline. But no. Sometimes the oldest tools remain the most effective. Locks, silence, isolation. The alarm system, crude though it was, may have been the most diabolical touch. Every time the girl dared to move, the house screamed her betrayal. Even when she wasn't trying to escape, she knew that the system stood ready to expose her. It wasn't just physical captivity, it was psychological. A constant reminder that even her body wasn't her own. And this wasn't temporary. This wasn't a few weeks of grounding. This was 6 years. 6 years of learning that the walls would not open, that freedom was something reserved for other people. The animals in the house only added to the nightmare. Dogs crammed into cages, chinchillas pacing in circles, the smell of neglect thick in the air. The girl was sometimes tasked with caring for them, which is a grim twist. You're chained, you're starved, but you're still expected to scoop dog food and clean cages. In other words, slavery disguised as chores. If you've ever wondered how abuse sustains itself, this is how. By blending cruelty with routine, by mixing horror with just enough normalcy that it becomes background noise. Chains become furniture, alarms become wallpaper. Eventually, even the victim stops believing that what's happening is extraordinary. Doctors who later examined her spoke of scars, both physical and emotional. Old marks on her wrists where restraints had rubbed. Malnourished muscles that struggled with ordinary movement. But more telling were the psychological signs. The way she flinched at sudden sounds. The way her voice faltered when recounting details. Trauma leaves fingerprints everywhere. And yet, here's the kicker. Throughout all of this, the perpetrators carried on with their lives. Mosley went to work as a train conductor. Brenda picked up groceries. They paid bills, walked the dogs, scrolled through their phones like everyone else. To the outside world, they were just another slightly odd couple in suburbia. On the inside, they were warden and guard, running a prison of 2 inmates, one chained, one silenced. It's tempting to ask, how do you even reach that point? What kind of person looks at a child and thinks, yes, this crate will do nicely? But part of the answer lies in control. Abuse isn't about anger, it's about ownership. The dog crate wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a statement. You are not free. You are not equal. You are mine. And the bathroom alarm? That was the exclamation mark at the end of the sentence. What makes this chapter of the story unbearable isn't only the details themselves, though they are chilling enough. It's the normalcy around them. The fact that this house, with its padlocks and cages, existed just meters away from people watering their lawns, gossiping about football scores, debating which pizza place delivered faster. Horror isn't hidden in forests or haunted castles. Sometimes it's just behind the beige siding of a semi-detached house. And that is why this story matters. Because if you think you'd notice, if you think you'd be the one to call, to knock, to intervene, remember that dozens of neighbors lived right here, and none of them did. On the surface, Brenda Spencer and Brandon Mosley were exactly what they claimed to be. A couple raising kids in a quiet corner of New Jersey. Nothing glamorous, nothing flashy. The kind of people who complain about gas prices, pick up takeout on Fridays, and talk about the weather more often than about feelings. Which is to say, unremarkable. But evil loves unremarkable. It hides best in the camouflage of dullness. Brenda, the mother, was 38. People who knew her in passing described her as tired-looking, withdrawn, not particularly social. She wasn't the PTA mom type, the kind who bakes brownies for fundraisers. She kept to herself, which in suburbia is often seen as quirky at worst, never alarming. If you don't want to join the neighborhood watch or gossip about lawn care, you're not considered suspicious. You're just private. Privacy is the perfect cloak. Mosley, the stepfather, was in his early 40s, working as a conductor for SEPTA, Philadelphia's transit system. A solid, respectable job. The kind that signals reliability. After all, who entrusts a man with entire trains if he's dangerous? It's the same logic that kept countless predators shielded. The uniform suggests authority, and authority suggests trustworthiness. But beneath that uniform, Mosley had a different role. Not provider, not protector, warden. Court documents later alleged that he sexually assaulted the girl, alongside the catalogue of physical abuse. It wasn't just captivity, it was exploitation in every imaginable form. The mother, Brenda, wasn't a passive bystander either. She wasn't the terrified woman living under his thumb. She was active, complicit, enforcing rules, cutting hair, locking doors. In many ways, her betrayal cuts deepest. A mother's job is to nurture, but she weaponized motherhood into torture. When arrested, both pled not guilty. Of course they did. Nobody who builds a dungeon in their bathroom ever looks a judge in the eye and says, "Fair cop, you got me." Instead, they spin excuses. Control becomes discipline. Locks become safety measures. Abuse becomes parenting choices. You'd almost admire the creativity if it weren't so grotesque. Neighbors had their impressions too. Some remembered Mosley as gruff, unfriendly, the kind of man who avoided small talk. Others said Brenda occasionally smiled, but never lingered in conversation. Nobody recalls being invited into their home. Nobody recalls birthday parties, kids running around in the yard, or family barbecues. In a town where community is built on potlucks and casual visits, they stood out. Not enough to raise alarms, but enough to register as odd. After the arrest, the refrain was predictable. They seemed normal. Because normal is a mask, and masks are easy to wear when nobody looks too closely. Psychologists who study these cases often talk about control couples, two people who, on their own, might never escalate to such horror, but together feed each other's worst instincts. Brenda and Brandon were a textbook. Her maternal authority legitimized the restrictions. His physical dominance enforced them. Together they created a closed circuit of cruelty, bouncing their justifications back and forth until they sounded like truth. This dynamic has history. Think of Rosemary and Fred West in England, or Michelle and David Turpin in California. Partners who, instead of pulling each other towards sanity, spiral together into madness. If you're ever wondering how two adults can sustain such grotesque treatment of a child for years, the answer is usually this. They make each other's sickness make sense. It's tempting to paint Brenda as the more sympathetic of the two, perhaps a victim herself, manipulated into compliance, but evidence suggests otherwise. She wasn't coerced into padlocking a bathroom. She wasn't blackmailed into cutting her daughter's hair as punishment. Those were her choices. Her hands held the scissors, her fingers snapped the lock shut. Mosley may have been the predator, but Brenda was the collaborator. When the police paraded them into custody, handcuffed, their faces were strangely blank. Not the wide-eyed panic of people caught in the act, but the flat affect of people who still believe they've done nothing wrong. Not guilty, they pled. Not guilty while their daughter sat in a hospital bed, bones visible under thin skin, telling doctors how her bathroom breaks were timed like military drills. Not guilty while photographs of cages and alarm systems were projected on courtroom screens. It's almost comical, in a bleak way. If they'd been characters in a TV drama, the audience would groan. Oh, come on. At least make them deny it with flair. But real life isn't scripted, and real cruelty is often this banal. The prosecution, however, isn't laughing. They've discussed plea deals, up to 50 years for Mosley, 25 for Brenda, long sentences, though some argue still too short. After all, their victim lost 6 years, 6 of the most formative years of her life. What's 25 years in comparison to that? But here's the darker truth. No sentence can really match the crime. Lock them up for a lifetime and it still doesn't give back the teenage years stolen behind padlocked doors. The irony, of course, is that in the eyes of their neighbours, Brenda and Brandon were simply another couple paying bills and minding their business. The same faces you might nod to at the supermarket. Let merge into traffic, or wave at while collecting the mail. Monsters rarely look monstrous. They look like the people who live 2 doors down. And that's why this story stings. Because if monsters wore masks with fangs and dripping blood, we'd all spot them. But they don't. They wear work uniforms. They carry groceries. They smile politely and say, "Have a nice day." Meanwhile, their house becomes a prison. Every horror story has its silences, spaces where the facts end and the questions begin. In the Spencer Mosley house, that silence takes the shape of another child, the younger sister. 13 years old when police stormed the home, alive, unharmed in the obvious ways, and yet curiously absent from most of the headlines. While her older sister was chained, starved, locked in bathrooms, the younger one moved through the same house under very different rules. No cage for her, no padlock across her door. She was homeschooled too, at least on paper, but her captivity looked nothing like her siblings. That detail alone has fueled endless speculation. So what was she? Victim, witness, bystander, pawn? The truth, of course, is messy. According to investigators, the younger girl was isolated as well, pulled out of school around the same time. She rarely left the house, rarely interacted with neighbors, but unlike her sister, she wasn't the one locked in a crate. She wasn't the one flinching under belts and cords, not in the same way. Which raises the most unsettling question of all. Did she know? Let's consider her perspective. You're 12, maybe 13. You live in a house where rooms are off limits, where doors are locked from the outside. You see your sister vanish into the bathroom for hours, days even. You hear muffled crying through the walls. You notice the dog crate in the corner, though no dog ever lives inside it for long. Children aren't stupid. They might not grasp the full horror, but they sense wrongness. They see things that don't add up, and they learn very quickly which questions are dangerous to ask. If Brenda and Brandon could terrorize one child, what did the younger sister have to fear if she spoke out? Silence in such a household isn't just survival, it's loyalty enforced by terror. And then there's the darker theory, that she was deliberately treated better to ensure her compliance. It's an old tactic used by abusers across history. Divide the victims, create a hierarchy. One suffers the worst, the other is spared just enough to keep quiet. It builds resentment, confusion, guilt, all while strengthening control. Imagine being that second child. You're not chained, but you're not free either. You watch, you know, but you also know that your survival depends on playing along. You eat when you're told, you follow rules, and you never, ever speak to outsiders. It's easier to stay invisible than to risk drawing the same punishments you've seen inflicted on your sister. When the police finally intervened, the younger girl was found in the house too. Malnourished? Not to the same degree. Injured? Not in the obvious ways. But trauma doesn't need shackles to leave its mark. She had grown up in an environment where cruelty was routine, where neglect was wallpaper. Her childhood was soaked in the atmosphere of abuse, even if she wasn't the direct target. Psychologists call this secondary victimization. Living in a theatre of violence, even as a spectator, brands the psyche. You don't need to be locked in the cage to carry its weight. The neighbors barely remember seeing her either. Some thought the family only had one daughter. Others recall glimpses, fleeting, like shadows behind curtains. This selective visibility is another trick of abusive households. Let one child disappear entirely while letting the other flicker in and out just enough to deflect suspicion. See, we're fine. She's right here. It's chilling, but effective. Authorities, already lax about homeschooling oversight, rarely dig deeper if one child appears functional. If a younger sibling is seen once or twice, it soothes curiosity. Nobody asks why the elder has gone missing. After the escape, the younger girl was placed in protective custody too. Authorities have released little about her, citing privacy. And that secrecy, while necessary, breeds speculation. Was she brainwashed into believing her sister deserved punishment? Did she try to help, or was she frozen by fear? Was she coerced into silence, or was silence simply all she had ever known? The human mind hates unanswered questions, so rumors fill the void. Some whisper that she was complicit, that she helped monitor alarms or enforce rules. Others argue she was just another prisoner, her cage less visible but no less real. The truth may never be known, not fully, not even by her. Trauma has a way of muddying memory. But here's the brutal irony. In court, Brenda and Brandon's defense may try to use her as evidence. See, the younger child was fine. No harm done. Clearly we weren't monsters. As though one daughter chained and starved is somehow mitigated by another left, technically unscathed. That's like arguing you're a responsible driver because you only hit one pedestrian. This is the grotesque logic of abusers. They measure cruelty in percentages, as if sparing one child balances out destroying another. The younger sister's silence lingers as one of the most haunting aspects of this case. Not because she failed her sibling, she was a child, and children aren't saviors, but because her very existence shows how abuse adapts. It doesn't always look like cages and padlocks. Sometimes it looks like letting one child breathe just enough to keep suspicion at bay. And so, while her older sister fought to survive chains, the younger one survived a different prison. Complicity forced by fear. Both are prisons you don't easily leave behind. In the mythology of true crime, escape moments are often cinematic. We like to imagine dramatic chases, windows smashed open, sirens already on the horizon. But reality is quieter, slower, and infinitely more precarious. In this case, the escape began with a decision. A decision made in silence after years of fear when the scales finally tipped from endurance to desperation. It was late spring 2025. The girl was 18 now, though her body looked younger, smaller, like someone had pressed pause on her growth. She had spent the day the way she spent most days, alone in confinement, rationed food, silence pressing against her skull. But sometime that evening, she chose. Tonight would be different. The opportunity came in fragments. The house was distracted. Mosley perhaps watching TV, Brenda fussing over the animals. The alarm on the bathroom door, though still wired, buzzed faintly when she tested it, but not loudly enough to bring immediate footsteps. And so she moved. Imagine that first step into the hallway. For you, walking from one room to another is nothing. For her, it was rebellion. Each creak of the floorboards might as well have been a gunshot. Each second stretched, elastic, swollen with dread. One wrong sound, one sudden shout, and she'd be shoved back into confinement, punished worse for daring. But the house didn't stir. She reached the front door. Her fingers, unsteady, fiddled with the lock. Think of how strange that must have felt. Touching the doorknob, the object that symbolized freedom all these years, finally within her grasp. How many times had she stared at it, wishing, praying, rehearsing in her head? And now, here she was, actually turning it. The door opened. Just a crack. Just enough for a sliver of suburban night to sneak in. Outside, the street was ordinary. Cars parked neatly along the curb. A porch light flickering in the distance. Sprinklers ticking on a lawn. Freedom doesn't look glamorous at first. It looks boring. And that boring street was her miracle. She stepped out, barefoot, thin, shaking. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, but she couldn't risk the noise. So she walked. Fast, urgent, but quiet. Past one house, then another. Her eyes scanned the windows. Would anyone see her? Anyone care? Finally, she reached the neighbor's porch. A door just like countless others, except this one represented a chance. Her knock was timid at first, then louder. The door opened, and for the first time in 6 years, she looked into the face of someone who wasn't her jailer. She whispered, "Please help me." The neighbor's reaction is worth pausing on, because here's the truth. Not everyone would have opened the door. Some people keep the chain latched, peek through the gap, and decide to mind their own business. Some wouldn't want the drama, the responsibility. But this neighbor, anonymous in the records, but a hero nonetheless, saw the state of the girl and acted. She pulled her inside, locked her own door, and grabbed the phone. The 911 call has since circulated. A woman's voice, tense, breathless. "There's a girl here." She says she's been held captive. She looks terrible. "Please, you need to send someone now." That call cracked the world open. Police cars arrived with the usual urgency. Lights flashing, sirens cutting through the quiet street. Neighbors emerged from houses, drawn by the noise, squinting into the night. And suddenly, the ordinary cul-de-sac was lit like a stage, every angle captured by the red and blue glow. The girl sat wrapped in a blanket, trembling but resolute. She answered questions softly, carefully. Yes, she'd been held. Yes, there were locks. Yes, she had been forced into a crate. Her words were hesitant, as if each syllable might trigger punishment. Trauma doesn't vanish the moment you step outside. It clings. It whispers that freedom is a trick. Inside the house, police made their discoveries. The cage, the locks, the alarm. Each object confirmed her story. Each object screamed louder than words ever could. For the officers, it was a rescue. For her, it was a gamble that had finally paid off. Because make no mistake, escape isn't just courage, it's calculation. Victims weigh the risks endlessly. If she had been caught, the punishment might have been unbearable, but she risked it anyway, and for once, fortune sided with her. The irony, of course, is that all it took was one step across the threshold. One turn of a doorknob, one shaky walk across the street. 6 years undone by a simple act. Freedom was always 20 feet away, and yet impossibly distant. That's the cruelty of captivity. The world goes on just beyond your wall, but might as well be another planet. The image of her that night remains the heart of this case. A girl, 18 but starved down to something younger, sitting under flashing lights, speaking haltingly about cages and chains while the neighbors craned their necks. People would later say they couldn't believe it. But the truth is, they didn't want to believe it. Because believing means admitting you lived next door to horror and did nothing. Her escape shattered that comfort. The morning after the rescue, Gloucester Township Police Headquarters looked less like a suburban station and more like the set of a disaster film. Reporters camped on the pavement, cameras stacked like rifles, microphones thrust at anyone wearing a badge. The phrase House of Horrors had already appeared in headlines overnight. Journalists are fast like that when there's tragedy to brand. By sunrise, the label was glued to the case, whether investigators liked it or not. Inside, detectives shuffled through stacks of evidence bags, padlocks, cords, a cheap buzzing alarm system, stained bedding, dog crates, all neatly tagged, photographed, catalogued. On their own, each item was grim. Together they painted a picture too grotesque to ignore. No one could claim misunderstanding. No one could call this eccentric parenting. You don't accidentally wire an alarm to a bathroom door. The first interviews with the victim were delicate. Trauma survivors don't speak in straight lines. Their stories come in fragments, stuttered and raw. Detectives ask simple questions. How long? Where? What happened when? And she answered in halting sentences. Locked in the bathroom for days, beaten with belts and cords, hair cut as punishment, food withheld, sometimes forced into the dog crate. The girl's words were shaky, but they matched the physical evidence perfectly. Every scar had a corresponding story. Every lock, every alarm, every cage confirmed her account. For investigators, this was the grim version of open and shut. And yet, as one officer allegedly muttered to a colleague, "This is going to haunt me." Not because of complexity, but because of simplicity. The cruelty was so banal, so deliberate, so sustained. Nothing hidden behind elaborate schemes. Just two adults deciding day after day to keep a child prisoner, and getting away with it for 6 years. Brenda Spencer and Brandon Mosley were arrested without drama, hauled into custody, faces blank, hands cuffed. The mugshots quickly went viral. Brenda looking sullen, Mosley expressionless. If you saw them without context, you might assume a DUI, maybe petty theft, the kind of mugshots you scroll past on a local news page. But underneath those flat expressions lay 6 years of horror. In their first statements, both pled not guilty. Of course they did. That's the script. But the excuses were already leaking. Mosley's attorney floated phrases like strict discipline and family misunderstanding. Brenda's side hinted at mental health struggles, coercion, victimhood, as if padlocks and cages just materialize when you're stressed. The detectives weren't impressed. Neither was the prosecutor, who swiftly began drafting charges: kidnapping, aggravated assault, child endangerment, sexual assault for Mosley. The list grew with each day of evidence review. If paper could bleed, those indictments would drip red. Meanwhile, the media circus was in full swing. Satellite trucks lined the street outside the family home. Neighbors were suddenly experts, giving breathless sound bites. We never suspected a thing. They seemed quiet but normal. Looking back, maybe I did hear something once. It was the usual chorus of hindsight. Everyone wants to be shocked, but no one wants to admit they ignored the signs. And the signs were there. The sudden homeschooling, the drawn curtains, the barking dogs, the smell that seeped into the air on summer nights. But denial is the most powerful narcotic in suburbia. Better to wave politely and convince yourself everything is fine. Now, of course, The same neighbors leaned against their fences, telling reporters how they always thought something was off. Sure you did. You thought it, and then you buried it under politeness. Because it's easier to live next to a monster if you tell yourself they're quirky instead. Forensic teams combed the house for days. Photographs taken inside would later leak online. The dog crate with scratch marks, the padlocked bathroom door, the tangled heap of extension cords and belts. Each image was worse than the last. And people clicked, shared, recoiled. That's how modern horror spreads, not by rumor, but by viral content. Social media turned the case into both tragedy and spectacle. Twitter threads dissected the alarm system. TikTok creators whispered into microphones about the bathroom dungeon. Reddit threads speculated endlessly about the psychology of the parents. Some users even drove to Gloucester Township, posing for selfies outside the house as if misery were a tourist attraction. Humanity never misses a chance to commodify suffering. Back in the police station, detectives tried to shield the younger sister from the spotlight. She was interviewed too, gently, though much less detail has been released about what she said. Her presence complicated the narrative. 2 daughters, 2 outcomes. Why one locked up and the other spared? Prosecutors would use it to show calculated cruelty. Defense attorneys inevitably would twist it into, see, the other child was fine. The prosecutor's job wasn't just to prove abuse, it was to crush the excuses before they sprouted. Because in court, abusers become poets. They dress cages as discipline, locks as protection, silence as love. Every word bends towards self-preservation. And if juries aren't careful, they might just believe it. By the end of May 2025, the case had already exploded nationally. News anchors leaned on phrases like modern-day dungeon and nightmare in New Jersey. True crime podcasts scrambled to record bonus episodes. Everyone wanted a piece of the horror. But for the detectives still logging evidence, for the victims still trembling in interviews, it wasn't a story. It was a reality that smelled of mildew and metal. The investigation was only beginning, but the narrative was already set. This was America's new house of horrors. Another entry in the grotesque lineage of Turpin, Fritzl, West. And once you're on that list, history doesn't forget. If the rescue was the crack in the facade, the courtroom became the demolition site. Because nothing strips away the polite veneers of suburbia faster than fluorescent lights, oak benches, and the sound of a judge calling names that everyone now knows for the wrong reasons. Brenda Spencer and Brandon Mosley were led in separately. Matching orange jumpsuits, wrists cuffed, the faint shuffle of prison-issued shoes against the linoleum floor. No more supermarket anonymity, no more illusion of being just another couple. Now they were defendants, their every gesture scrutinized, their every blink interpreted. The charges came first, read aloud in a tone so flat it almost disguised their weight. Kidnapping, aggravated assault, child endangerment, sexual assault. Each one like a hammer blow, stacking years onto years, until the number was so high it barely mattered. 50 years, maybe more for Mosley, 25 for Brenda. You don't come back from numbers like that. The defendants responded the way most do in America's justice system. Not guilty? Of course. Pleading guilty at the start would be far too honest, and honesty isn't the currency here. Instead, their lawyers leaned into the tired strategies that have been recycled in every abuse trial since the dawn of courtrooms. For Brenda, the role of the reluctant accomplice, a mother trapped by her domineering partner, too broken to resist, too fragile to protect. For Mosley, The narrative of strict discipline misinterpreted by outsiders. They were trying to keep her safe. Safe from what exactly? Fresh air, education, human dignity. You almost have to admire the audacity. Almost. The prosecutor, however, was prepared. The evidence was a theatre of cruelty. Photographs of the cage, the padlocked bathroom door, the buzzing alarm system, belts coiled like snakes in evidence bags. Each image projected onto courtroom screens, each one hammering home the same truth. This wasn't discipline. This was imprisonment. And then came the victim's testimony. Soft, halting, but devastating. She described nights in the dog crate, days locked in the bathroom, meals withheld, hair hacked away in patches. The jurors leaned forward, some visibly uncomfortable. No one doubted her words when the scars on her wrists matched the story. No one mistook the tremble in her voice for fabrication. If there's one thing that shatters defense strategies, it's the raw honesty of someone who has nothing left to gain from lying. The younger sister was mentioned too, though her testimony was more guarded. Shielded from public view, protected by legal privacy, her presence was nonetheless felt. Her very existence complicated things. Why was one child locked up and the other not? The defense tried to spin it. If they were truly monsters, wouldn't both girls have suffered equally? As though cruelty must be democratic to be real. The prosecution countered easily. This wasn't inconsistency. It was strategy. Keeping one child relatively normal made it easier to maintain appearances, to deflect suspicion, divide and control. A tactic as old as power itself. Meanwhile, the courtroom buzzed with media presence. Every seat filled, every recess analysed outside by talking heads. True crime. YouTubers uploaded breakdowns within hours. Tabloid headlines screamed about the dungeon parents. The courthouse steps became a stage for public outrage. Inside, however, it was quieter. Courtrooms are not built for spectacle. They're built for process. And process is slow, grinding, meticulous. Witnesses called, cross-examinations endured, objections raised. The kind of slow burn that exhausts everyone involved, especially the victim. Because here's the cruel irony. Surviving 6 years of captivity was only the first battle. The courtroom was the second. And in some ways, it was worse. At least in captivity, she knew her jailers were enemies. In court, she had to sit across from them, tell her story while they stared back, shake her voice into words while defense lawyers dissected her pain. Legal systems don't heal trauma. They document it. Brenda and Mosley sat through it, all with expressions that barely shifted. Brenda occasionally looked down, eyes glassy, as though trying to conjure the image of a victim herself. Mosley remained rigid, jaw set, as if daring the court to believe he had simply been misunderstood. Their lack of visible remorse only deepened the disgust. At one point, when photographs of the padlocked bathroom were shown, a murmur rippled through the courtroom gallery. Ordinary citizens sitting in the back rows whispering, "Jesus Christ," under their breath. Because the images didn't need commentary. They screamed for themselves. And so the trial became what these trials always become, a battle of narratives, the defense spinning tales of misunderstanding, coercion, mental health, the prosecution grounding everything in locks, scars, alarms, and testimony. The jury caught in the middle, though really there was no middle ground to be had. The outcome wasn't in doubt, not for anyone watching, but the process still had to play out. Every box ticked, every objection ruled upon, every painful detail retold. Because justice, unlike horror, is not efficient. The gavel fell, as it always does, with a dull wooden thud. Nothing cinematic, nothing dramatic, just a sound that marked the official end of a nightmare. Mosley was sentenced to decades behind bars, half a century give or take, while Brenda received her own long stretch, though shorter than his. Orange jumpsuits became their new suburban uniform, and the beige walls of prison cells replaced the beige siding of their house. But sentencing is not an ending, it's a pause. For the victim, now legally an adult, freedom wasn't a sudden rush of joy. It was disorienting. 6 years in captivity means 6 years without teenage milestones. No school dances, no first jobs, no late night hangouts with friends, no trivial heartbreaks. Instead, her adolescence was a catalogue of hunger, silence, and fear. Stepping into the world again meant confronting all of that at once. Doctors treated her malnourishment. Therapists tried to mend her fractured trust. Caseworkers guided her through systems designed to protect, but often too overwhelmed to heal. Imagine being 18 and having to learn not just algebra, but how to order at a restaurant, how to manage money, how to trust that a locked door is meant to keep you safe, not to keep you in. Trauma is a stubborn teacher. It doesn't stop when the abuser is in handcuffs. The younger sister, too, began her own path under state protection. Her story is more opaque, sealed by privacy laws, hidden from tabloids. But one thing is certain. Surviving a house like that leaves marks even if you never wore the chains. Silence becomes its own kind of cage. As for the neighbors, they slipped quickly into the ritual of denial and hindsight. In the weeks following the sentencing, you could hear it in their interviews, see it in their gestures as reporters shoved microphones in their faces. We never knew. We thought they were private people. We feel so guilty now. But guilt in retrospect is a luxury. Where was it when the smell leaked from the house? Where was it when the curtains stayed drawn for years? Where was it when one girl simply vanished from school with a one-word excuse? Homeschooling? It's easy to feel shocked when the evidence is bagged and photographed. It's harder to be curious when the horror is still hidden. The house itself became a morbid landmark. For weeks, strangers drove by, slowing down to stare, snapping photos from their car windows. Some came on foot, pausing on the pavement, whispering about cages and alarms as though they were ghost stories. Eventually, the township boarded it up, trying to contain the spectacle. But places like that never fade quietly. They rot into urban legend, whispered about long after the siding peels away. The media moved on, of course, it always does. One headline replaces another, one tragedy eclipsed by the next. But for the girl who escaped, moving on isn't so simple. She carries her house with her, the crate, the padlock, the buzzing alarm, tucked into her memory. Healing will take years, maybe decades, and some wounds don't close completely. That's the cruel truth. The justice system locks away the perpetrators, but the victim remains locked in memories. There is no parole from nightmares. Yet there's also resilience. Survivors of such cruelty often find ways to rebuild, to reclaim their narratives. Maybe she will one day write, speak, advocate. Or maybe she will choose anonymity, disappearing into the quiet she deserves, letting the world forget her name while she reclaims her life. Either path is valid. Both are survival. So what lingers for us, the outsiders? Maybe it's the question of oversight, how homeschooling loopholes shielded abuse. Maybe it's the role of neighbors who chose silence over suspicion. Maybe it's the uncomfortable reminder that evil doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't wear a mask, doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just waters the lawn next to yours, waves politely, and goes back inside to lock a bathroom door. That is why the House of Horrors matters. Because it isn't just their story, it's a reflection in the mirror suburbia doesn't want to look into. And so we close. The case file is thick, the headlines archived, the house boarded up. Brenda and Mosley rot in cells, stripped of their illusions of control. The girl, no longer their prisoner, walks free, though her steps are heavier than they should be at 18. The world outside her door is still waiting, and this time, it's hers. And that sleepless rabble was the House of Horrors. A story that reminds us how ordinary walls can hide the most unordinary nightmares. We're a young channel here, still finding our footing in this strange YouTube jungle. But we're pouring a lot of time and care into bringing you stories that are more than just copy-paste headlines. Something atmospheric, researched, and maybe a little different than the usual noise out there. If you made it this far, you're basically family already. And here's the deal. YouTube has no idea we exist unless you help us wave the flag. A like, a comment, a share, or hitting that subscribe button isn't just vanity. It actually tells the algorithm, hey, this is worth showing to more people. So if you enjoyed drifting through this dark corner of suburbia with me tonight, tap that button, drop us a line in the comments, and maybe even tell us what kind of stories you'd like me to cover next. It helps us more than you think. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, turning the unsettling into something you can fall asleep to. Until next time, sleep well, rabble.